Fellow Mizrahi Jew Gad Saad is on with the idiot himself, Piers Morgan. Let's take a look at this clip. I'm Tal, the Traveling Clout, your favorite Zionist prince.
I want to start just by what Mehdi Hassan told me about Islamophobia, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you're kind of the view it doesn't really exist, and that you shouldn't be silenced from criticizing Islam by people shouting you're Islamophobic. Now, Mehdi Hassan, and I subscribe to this as well, I think if you launch the kind of ferocious, relentless attacks that someone like Tommy Robinson has done on Islam and Muslims in the way that he's done so many times, it's eventually pretty painfully obvious to people that you're coming at this from a bigoted position. And therefore, by the dictionary definition of Islamophobia, if it comes from a place of hate, that actually is Islamophobia, isn't it?
Thank you so much for having me back, Piers. The devil is in the details, right? So if I were to say that Jews are inherently diseased, they are degenerates, they are evil, they're parasites, that would be anti-Semitic. If I say there are teachings in the Torah that are abhorrent given today's moral codes, that wouldn't be anti-Semitic. So if you were to make dispositional statements about individual Muslims, that would be Muslim bigotry. But if you say anything you want about the codified content of Islam, then by definition, that cannot be Islamophobic.
Okay, so let me play you a little mashup of examples, I would say, where Tommy Robinson has displayed Islamophobia by the criteria in the dictionary. Let's take a look.
We will unify every community against the hostility and barbarianism of Islam. I'm not racist, I despise racism. Islam is not a race. Islam is a fascist, violent ideology which masquerades as a religion.
Every single Muslim watching this video on YouTube, on 7/7, you got away with killing and maiming British citizens.
But we embrace migrants that come to this country and love it. The problem is Islamic migrants come to this country and declare war on it.
Now, when you hear all that, and in particular, it felt to me that what he said about 7/7, which was a bunch of extremist terrorists who happened to be Muslim committing terrorism. When you basically, at a crowd with a loud hailer in your mouth, embrace every single Muslim in the country and say you're all to blame for killing and maiming Brits, that is Islamophobic, isn't it? I mean, it has to be. Otherwise,
so
what is?
Let me address this in using two examples. The number one predictor of child abuse is if there is a step-parent in the house. It is 100 times greater predictor than all other predictors. And yet, most step-parents are perfectly lovely and kind and don't commit abuse. So understanding statistical reasoning and causal inferencing is important. So let me give a second example. Since 9/11 alone, there have been 46,000 plus terror attacks committed in roughly 70 countries by Islamic terrorists. That is an absolute fact, notwithstanding the fact that out of 2 billion Muslims, most did not commit terrorist acts. So we can point to 7/7 and say that that was driven by Islamic ideology, while also speaking from the other side of our mouths that most Muslims that we'll ever meet are peaceful. Both of those two statements are true.
But what the peaceful Muslims would say is that actually it's the twisting of the Islam ideology by extremists that is the problem. It's not a genuine interpretation of Islam, because the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful. So they say,
that's
look,
not true.
Well, is it not true?
No, it isn't.
If that wasn't true,
so
then if that wasn't true, then wouldn't de facto most Muslims commit acts of terrorism?
Most Jews eat prosciutto and also eat shrimps, but they're not practicing a more gentle form of kosher law. They simply ignore the fact that kosher laws dictate that you don't eat shrimps and that you don't eat prosciutto, right? I eat prosciutto. I'm Jewish. I'm not practicing a more peaceful version of Judaism. I just ignore that which I don't wish to apply. Most Muslims don't commit those acts because they are kind and decent people who choose to ignore whichever they don't wish to follow in their texts. But does Islam contain endless quotes, endless edicts that are profoundly problematic to the kuffar? The answer is a resounding yes.
Does the Bible do that?
Yeah, of course the Bible does that.
Right.
But
So the same.
as
So,
far
you,
as
so you're saying you would have the same view of Christianity, for example, would you?
well, if Christians were going around right now quoting passages from the New Testament and committing 46,000 plus terror attacks in nearly 70 countries since 9/11 alone, then I would say we need to worry about those texts. If they were Talmudic extremists doing that, then we would worry about that. Look, Deuteronomy has a lot of nasty things. Find the Elamites and kill them. But I don't know many guys called Mordechai Rubenstein looking for Amalekites to kill them. So, common sense matters, right? Most Muslims are lovely. I know more Muslims than most people will ever meet in their lives. None of them have ever been terrorists. This doesn't take away from the fact that there is a astounding problem with Islamic terrorism. Both those statements are true.
It is, but I would say that, to give you two parallels, very different things. One, as somebody put to me on X today, during the years when the IRA were committing appalling acts of terrorism, it would be like saying, well, then all, according to Tommy Robinson, his logic would say all Irish people are to blame for the maiming and killing, right? Which clearly would have been an outrageous thing to say. Secondly, and I raised this with someone the other day on the show who was incensed that I would even draw this parallel, but I said, why not? If you look at the number of mass shootings in America in the last 30 years, they're almost exclusively perpetrated by deranged young white men. So does that mean that we should, by the same logic, say, well, there's all these terrible mass shootings going on, they're all being committed by the same type of profile of person, therefore all young white men in America have to be treated with deep suspicion, which is what Tommy Robinson that's where his logic takes you. That's why I have a problem with the Tommy Robinsons of this world. It's not his message and banging the drum about the rape gang scandal. He's been absolutely right about that. It's just he's such a flawed messenger for all sorts of other reasons. And the reason that's problematic is because he gets used by people who are trying to avoid accountability, because they say, well, look at this guy, the one who's shouting loudest about us, look at him. He's a convicted football thug. He beats up policemen and gets convicted for it. He's a mortgage fraudster. He's a passport faker. He's committed contempt of court 3 times. He's nearly wrecked trials involving the rape gang scandals. He's made a Syrian refugee boy's life utter hell with his lies. That's why he's now in prison, and so on. In other words, by demonizing the messenger, those who should be held to account are able to hide behind Tommy Robinson being the flag bearer for all this. I think that is a problem.
Look, Tommy Robinson has some issues in his past. I don't know all of them, although I've had a chance to have long conversations with him. He's even come to visit me in Montreal. He never, in my presence, said anything that struck me as bigoted or racist. So I'm not here to defend Tommy Robinson. Christopher Hitchens, whom I'm sure you know well, he's a compatriot British. Excuse me?
I employed him when I was editor of the Daily Mirror. And when I employed him, I know what you're about to say to me about what he said about Islamophobia. Before you say it, and you're right to say it, I would point out I hired him during the Iraq War because he supported that war, and the paper opposed it before, during, and after. And I thought it was important to have a voice in the paper up against John Pilger, actually, quite often, who was obviously viscerally against the war. But I let Hitchens run riot. Even though I thought he was completely wrong, and even though I look back on it now and I'm convinced he was completely wrong. So Hitchens wasn't always right, before you say to me what he said about Islamophobia, which you're about to do.
Well, I mean, yes, I could make the point about what he said about Islamophobia, but the point that I was going to make is that Christopher Hitchens is, and I think you'll probably agree with this, one of the most eloquent speakers that we will have ever seen, right? He has beautiful British accent. He speaks with a beautiful vocabulary, as does Douglas Murray. So they may say things that are, in terms of their content, absolutely indistinguishable from anything that Tommy Robinson says. But Tommy Robinson's style, his accent, is one that serves as an aesthetic injury to the people who carry the progressive lisp. And therefore, people react to Tommy Robinson because of his style of delivery. Elon Musk, who's, as you know, is a good friend of mine, has a direct way of speaking that is not as eloquent as Christopher Hitchens. That doesn't in any way imply that what he is saying is not veridical. So we have to differentiate between the substance and the content.
I don't disagree.
Tommy Robinson.
I've always said that actually about Donald Trump. Same thing, that the rhetoric often bears little relation to what he actually does. I also think it's important to focus on what people actually do. My problem with Elon, who I think is a complete genius, my problem over this week has been the way he's targeted Jess Phillips, a female MP, in my view, wrongly and inaccurately, but that's neither here nor there. By calling her a genocidal rape apologist, he's put a massive target on her head where people have now been arrested for threatening her life. And we've had 2 members of parliament, including a young woman, who've been murdered in the last 10 years in this country. I just think that kind of language crosses a line.
But look how Piers Morgan gives 0 fucks about the women and the people being raped by rape gangs. Like, obviously that's terrible that politicians are being killed, but it's such terrible posturing. Like, he picks and chooses all the time when he wants to count the deaths of people and when not. It's so fucked up.
Would you agree?
Look, I hear you. I get that. I've been accused of being the orchestrator of the killing of Gazan children. I sit as a professor who's 60 years old in Montreal doing evolutionary psychology research. I have nothing to do with the killing of anyone in Gaza, yet I am the baby genocidal killer. So, of course, I empathize with the point that you're making. And that's why I said that sometimes Elon might be very blunt in the way he says what he says, but the content of what he's saying, the ire that he has, really is coming from a good place, right? Britain does suffer from an orgiastic form of suicidal empathy, the topic of my forthcoming book, because they're much more desirous of protecting the sensibilities of their Muslim population than to worry about the integrity of the bodily and the integrity of children. That's not a good calculus to have. I think that's what triggered the ire of Elon. The fact that he went after this person is regrettable. I share your concern there. But again, I think the fact that you and I and others are having these important conversations, only good things can come from
No,
that.
I completely agree. And actually having...
I think Gad Saad is probably the person that we should listen to most on this because he really understands it from the inside. The thing is, here's the thing. With Tommy Robinson, with all the criticism you can give him, I've never endorsed him on this channel, but I've known of this man for many years now, and I've known of his positions on these. The guy grew up in a city where he watched Islamic radicals change the fabric of the city, change the fabric of the society. You cannot discount his point. In the same way that, okay, for example, people like Piers Morgan will try to rationalize the extremist Palestinian positions, right? Saying they're martyrs and freedom fighters, whatever it is. The same way that you cannot discount the Tommy Robinsons of the world as well. From their perspective, they're watching their communities, their towns, their villages, their cities being taken away from them in real time with nothing happening. With nothing happening in regards to it. You have to look at it from their perspective too and understand where they're coming from. You have to. If you don't, you're a terrible person. You're not being fair. You're not being equal. And that's reality. That's reality, ladies and gentlemen. I'll see you guys in the next one. I love you a long time. Goodbye, class. If you believe in my content and want to support me, just know your help is needed. There's a bunch of great ways to support me, being PayPal, Buy Me a Coffee, or joining my Patreon community down below. Patreon is the best way to support my channel, and you'll get a bunch of cool perks depending on what tier you join. Another great way to support me is by buying my merchandise on thetravelingclat.com. I regularly drop new merch designs like this beautiful hat, or this amazing shirt, where you can support the channel and get something cool for yourself. I also have an amazing Discord community with people from all over the world. Thank you so much for your support.